So today I've asked Social Development Minister Paul Bennett to join me in making an announcement about welfare, the Welfare Reform Programme. So we'll run through some of the details for you and then take any questions before covering off the other questions and other areas that you might have. Today I'm pleased to announce that Cabinet has agreed the final details of the next stage of the Government's major welfare reform programme. As you know, the National League Government has had a very strong focus on welfare over the past 3 and a bit years. We believe that those who can work should work, and we'll help them to do just that. Delivering better public services is one of the National League Government's 4 key priorities for our second term, and welfare reform is a significant component of this. We've introduced a number of changes to benefits in 2010 which are already having positive effects. The future focus changes include a requirement that those receiving the unemployment benefit reapply for it after 1 year. That simple change has seen 12,500 people cancel their benefit, saving $17 million. Of that number, more than half didn't even complete the application, and more than 3,300 had already found a job. What this shows is that a more active approach to welfare has the potential to achieve positive results. With that in mind, last November we announced a comprehensive reform of the benefits system, building off the recommendations of the Welfare Working Group. The reforms we are undertaking is so comprehensive that Cabinet has agreed we will action it in 2 stages. It will be implemented over 2 years to improve the way help is delivered to those in genuine need. I think it's clear to almost everyone the current benefit system is simply not working and not delivering for New Zealand. 351,000 people, or 13% of New Zealand's working age population, are on a benefit, while 220,000 children live in benefit-dependent homes. This is creating too many vulnerable people and trapping them into a life of limited choices, poverty and poor health. Evidence clearly shows children are better off when their parents are in work and not on welfare. Social Development Minister Paul Bennett will go through some of the finer details of the next stage of our programme in a moment. But first I want to give you an outline of what's happening. Next month, the first of 2 bills to bring our welfare reform policies into action will be introduced to the House. The first bill will broadly do 2 things. Firstly, it will make significant changes for young people aged 16 to 18, including teen parents. And it will also put work obligations on beneficiaries with children, as well as those on widows and women's alone benefits. I'm going to talk now about the youth component of the changes, and after that Paul will talk more about the wider work obligations for beneficiaries. Young people aged 16 to 17 and teen parents up to 18 years of age will no longer be given a benefit check and left to their own devices. From July, we will be funding providers to work alongside these young people to make sure that they are in education, training or work. We will also help them to make decisions that will put them on a path to employment and take them off the fast track to a life on welfare. We will help them get re-engaged in education, and we will help them to learn to manage their finances better and make good life decisions. Most young people will be required to be in education, training or work-based learning in order to receive either a new youth payment or a new young parent payment. These will replace the current youth benefits. Some of the basic costs for a young person, like rent and power, will be paid directly to suppliers, and living costs like groceries will be loaded onto a payment card that cannot be used to purchase alcohol and cigarettes. A small in-hand allowance will also be paid direct to that young person. Another new approach we will take with these young people is that we're going to reward them when they make good decisions. For example, teen parents will receive an extra $10 per week when they complete a parenting course. Young people will be able to receive an extra $10 a week if they complete a budgeting course. Likewise, after 6 months of good attendance at school or education, they'll get an extra $10 a week, although these payments could be taken away from a young person if they go off the tracks. That means young people could potentially be getting an extra $20 to $30 a week for making good decisions. Changes around young people, including teen parents, will be phased in from 30th of July this year. Stage 2 of our welfare reform will see benefit categories overhauled to ensure that those who can work do work, there will also be measures to clamp down on welfare fraud. I strongly believe that we need a benefit system that focuses on what people can do rather than what they can't do, that challenges people, not treats them as passive recipients of benefits, and that provides support, training and opportunities for people to return to the workforce. That's what our package of reforms is all about, and I make no apology for wanting New Zealand to be a country of work, enterprise and self-reliance. I'd also like to reiterate there won't be any cuts to main benefit rates in our reforms, and these rates will continue to be adjusted for inflation. Our welfare reform program is about making a much more active and investment-focused benefit system. I'd now like to hand over to the Minister. She'll take you through some details, and then we'll take any questions you have on welfare, and then go back to other questions after that.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. I suppose I'd like to make the point that we are fundamentally changing the welfare system. So by the time we get to the end of this reform process, you will see a very different welfare system. Welfare system was created in 1935, and we see the Act of the 1960s. The reality is that we need to get it into modern New Zealand and modernise the system so that it's ready for 2012 and going forward, and that's what you will see. Social norms have changed, so have people's needs, so has technology, and we simply have an obligation to make sure that we're keeping up with that and getting a system that actually works for the people of New Zealand. Underpinning the whole system will be the investment approach, of which you will see more details in the second stage of these reforms next year. But we've talked about it before, and I just want to reiterate it being really the fundamental approach to how we move forward on welfare. So that's looking at that long-term liability. It is quite changing the way and whom we work with and whom we spend money on. And to give you an example, really those on the unemployment benefit are effectively only about 10% of the long-term liability, so those who are most likely to cost the most and stay the longest. However, we spend about 90% of our spend on them, and we simply have to change that. So a big part of what I'm talking about today on the basis and on the back of what the Prime Minister talked about with the youth payments and the changes to them are some of those changes to those on the DPB and changes to those with children. So we are introducing more support for sole parents than ever before. The average duration on the DPB is 7 to 10 years, and the DPB costs taxpayers around $5 million a day. Currently, in those differences, the changes that we made 2 years ago, were that we brought the part-time work test for those who had a youngest child at 6 years old. We're taking that back to 5 years old. So a woman on the DPB or a man on the DPB will now be part-time work tested when their youngest is 5, and there will now for the first time be a full-time work test when their youngest is 14 years. That will affect around 11,000 people will now be full-time work tested, so they have children 14 years or over. And the whole changes made to the widows and the women's alone and the DPB will see changes for about 30,000 on that. So that is adding on from the fundamental changes that we made in 2010, now bringing that back to part-time work testing at 5 years old and a full-time work test when that youngest is 14. Alongside that are changes to widows and women alone. The reality is that men can't get them. The widow's benefit was introduced in 1911, so here we are more than 100 years later, so it just makes sense that we bring that in line as well. So there will be, we expect those people to be available for work depending on the age of their children or if they have children. So those that do not have children will be part-time, will be work tested full-time. Those that have children, depending on the age, will be in line with the DPB. Though these will be brought into effect in October. So the changes that the Prime Minister mentioned, as he said, were July. The changes to the DPB and the widows and the women alone will be brought in October. We'll see a second bill coming through in about August this year, with those changes really being implemented in 2013.
Questions?
Well, actually, just picking up on the changes for the widows, is there any flexibility in the system there? Because, you know, you can imagine someone, their spouse dies, a month later their kid hits the age of which they get work tested, go back to work full time, and they're still going through the, I I mean, do you have any flexibility?
So to start with, there will be a time for people to kind of readjust to new circumstances. We do that certainly around domestic violence as well, and people that are getting out of some relationships. They need some time to adjust to their new circumstances. So that will be recognised, so it may not be immediate, and in some cases will take a few months, and there'll be some flexibility in that. As I say, it does also depend on the age of the children. Also, though, that investment approach is quite going to determine whom they work with and how and how much. And so it would kind of depend on, at times, the sort of the work experience they've got and the age and everything else as to what they do with them.
Will the investment approach mean more money? Because one of the reasons why so much money is spent on the unemployment benefit, I guess it's a bit like triage. They're the easiest ones to deal with and the quickest ones to get back to work. The approach you're taking presumably is to deal with people who are more difficult to get back to work and will take more time, more investment presumably.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So ultimately what we do is you would argue that there will be some that we spend a lot of time and a lot of money on that would have gone back into work themselves anyway of their own means, and others that we're spending nothing on and are getting no support and none of the benefits of actually having external agencies work with them and the extras that come with that. So we will be, the investment approach, we look at how and who they spend it on, and it can look quite different over a period of time. You'll also see them trialling some stuff. So you will have them working on something and really evaluating whether it works, whether it moves them off, and whether it's the right way to go. And it's kind of at a macro, a cohort, and an individual level, if you like.
But are you budgeting to spend more money?
Yes, we are. So, at the moment we're saying more than $130 million a year is the kind of spend by the time you get to the end of these reforms, and it's projected to have a sort of $1 billion saving over 4 years.
How much is the allowance for young people that in-hand allowance?
It depends on their circumstances. So at the moment, the independent youth benefit, so the IYB, is around sort of $200 a week. So depending on what their board is, so for some, for example, their food, their board, their power, their everything will actually be encompassed in that payment. So you would have some on an in-hand allowance and some on a card, but probably more on the in-hand in other cases. But the sort of maximum around that in-hand allowance is $50 a week.
How many needs do you expect to be targeted by the $10 and that $10 a week payment? How many of them do you expect to take it up?
No, we think they will, because also remembering the whole thing with the youth packages that they're going to be really connected to a social service provider. So, for example, that young person comes in and says, I want to go on a benefit, or that young person is just found to be not engaged in educational training or employment. First thing we're going to do is attach them to an external provider like the Salvation, for example, the Salvation Army, for example, or one of your local iwi trusts or something like that. They will then go through a budget with that young person, and we'll talk about the expectations coming up. And they will also get a payment, a milestone achievement payment, if that young person achieves finishes a budgeting course or a parenting course. So that's quite an incentive for them to walk them through the process.
But I mean, how many of them do you think? How many people do you think will take this?
Yeah, well, we've costed it, and the cost if the sort of numbers that we think will, then we think they see the cost of being about an extra $3.8 million a year. There's 3,000 both teen parents and those on the IYB, and sort of a reasonable percentage of them take it up over time, and that's the kind of cost.
It says in here that sole parents with young children and those on the supported living payment will be eligible for a financial incentive if they decide to take up work earlier than expectations require them to. What are those expectations?
Yeah, I'm delighted with this one. So Cabinet has agreed that actually for those that outside of the work expectations, if they take up full-time work, they can keep their benefit being reduced by $100 a week. And that's just recognising that move of going from benefit and into work can be pretty stressful. You've got additional costs, you've got to think about travel, you've got sort of different things. So we're actually graduating them losing their benefit by losing it by $100 a week instead of an instant losing it.
What are the expectations?
So that's if they go into full-time work outside of the work test period. So, at the moment the full-time work test, with the changes we're making, will be when their youngest is 14. If they go into full-time work out of that, they can actually have lose their benefit graduated instead of the instant loss.
Isn't all this going to depend on the economy and how many jobs are created? Because, under the 9 years of previous Labor government, they knocked about 140,000 off benefits, essentially on the back of economic growth and more jobs. If there are no jobs, whatever changes you make to the welfare system will make no real difference, right?
For a start, there's all the economic forecasters are predicting strength and growth in the labour markets. So there's going to be more jobs in the economy. Of the best information we have, it doesn't matter really whether you look at the Treasury's forecast, the Reserve Bank or the private sector economists, that's the best. Second thing is, look, I think you saw over that period of time, you're right, there was volatility and a reduction overall in the number of people on unemployment benefit, but there was also an increase in those other benefit categories. And so, as the Minister said, that's really one of the big areas of focus of attention. But you're right, I mean, in the end, people have to find work. We're simply making them, they have to be work available. At the end of the day, if the jobs aren't there, well, then they continue to enjoy all of their benefits. But the emphasis has got to be, I think, on us to be an economy which creates work and creates jobs. I think there are jobs out there. We constantly see that through our work and income officers that they're registering 1,000, 2,000 jobs a week. So there are jobs there. We need to make sure those people who are currently on benefits, some of them are reskilled and retrained so that they can take advantage of it. Sometimes it's just confidence. They're out of the workforce for a period of time. It's hard for them to get back and get a job. There's some encouragement to do that.
Have you set the rates for the success or incentive fees for the private providers?
No, we're currently, we're just about to start the RFP process for that. But I think this is really important. So this is where we're going to be working with sort of up to 14,000 young people with those service providers, because it's not just those that are on benefit, it's also those that are not engaged in employment or training. For some, we will be paying a very minimal amount. Quite frankly, they are not hugely at risk and perhaps just need a little bit of a push in the right direction, or they're just sort of slightly lost. Others have pretty complex needs, whether that be around a sort of a family history of welfare dependence, a history with a child, youth and family, drug and alcohol, and they are going to be more expensive and need a lot more time and a lot more investment. So it's going to look quite different. So for some, you could be spending $500, for others you could be spending several thousand on them.
So the Treasury brought up concerns about the robustness of that system, the contracting and actually the general sort of setup. Can you reassure people that that is going to be a robust system for giving out those contracts and for following it up later on?
So where Treasury had it wrong was they presumed that the providers themselves were going to be deciding who was at risk and who was not and what level of. They won't be doing that. So a fundamental changes, part of these changes is that we're going to be changing laws so that school have to report in real time when kids are not there, when they've dropped out and when they are no longer engaged. We're then going to combine that with the information that we hold on them through the Ministry of Social Development, which at times is pretty significant. We know if there's a history of welfare dependence in the household, if there's a history of child and family, we know if they live in state housing, we actually know and can get quite a big picture. The school will tell us about what their attendance has been like and what their records. Once you put all that together, you can actually see a much clearer picture of whom is at risk and who is not. And we will incentivise the provider with milestone payments like I've described that get them with the kind of outcomes that we want for these kids.
So how do you stop someone being, having a contract, you're saying, 14,000, that person getting the contract and then just sort of carrying on and receiving payments, or carrying on with that into the future?
Well, for a start, they're going to get an administration fee up front, and then as that young person reaches milestones, they will get a further payment from the department. So it's not like they're just getting regular payments no matter what happens. It will be paid based on actual and real outcomes following that individual child or young person, and that's going to be a big difference. But I actually think there's pretty amazing organisations that are working with these young people for all the right reasons. If we collect data better, if we give them more information on them, then we're very confident that we can have different outcomes.
Did you let Treasury know they were wrong?
Well, yeah, one would presume I did.
How'd they take it?
And have. Oh look, that's an old paper as well. That was back in April last year, and so here we are, sort of 10 months later. But we've worked our way through it, and certainly are pretty excited about the next stage of these reforms.
So how many
So the
just
last
National Labour Force survey put the NEET rate for 15 to 24-year-olds at 13%. Do you have a target you'd like to see it come down to in the time frame for that?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're blatantly targeting 16 and 17-year-olds, and for all the right reasons. I mean, when you look at them, 90% of those NEET will go on a benefit when they turn 18. So if you're looking at A, who's on benefit the longest, who has the highest risk of being there, and actually seeing that intergenerational welfare dependence, it is those young people. So we're blatantly targeting that sort of up to 14,000, and that's how you just kind of stop that sort of chain that leads to them being still needed at 21, 22.
But you have a figure you'd like to see that 13% drop to?
Oh look, I think we always want it to be significantly lower, but no, I don't have a particular number in mind that we're working towards.
Are there specific training courses that wouldn't be accepted? I mean, have you got a list of would and wouldn't?
I think we're still working our way through that process with the RFP and working with the provider. So without a doubt, we've got clear focus on it being that we're getting these kids, these youth in particular, work ready and work available. So it would have to be in line with that.
So you want to get 46,000 off? Is that? I mean, what's the time period for that?
So we've seen the projections that have been done tell us up to 46,000 over 4 years, plus another 11,000 in part-time work, and that's on top of the kind of Treasury predictions of 20,000 just because of the economy and the jobs that become available. So those are the kind of figures we're seeing over 4 years, which are the projections that we've been working to.
Sorry, Minister, just the 14,000, is that what you're targeting the cash incentive at? You're hoping that it could reach up to 14,000 next?
We'll work with 14,000 through our service providers, and of them 3,000 are on benefit and will be eligible for the payment card and the incentive payments.
So there's a big group that aren't on the benefit. They're not in work, they're not in training, they're not at school, but we know they're on a collision course with the benefit, because when they turn 18,
that's the 3,000.
that's the 11,000, the other 3,000 are already on a benefit because their personal circumstances dictate that they get something.
Is it realistic to expect that you're going to be able to catch all those 11,000, that they're not just going to slip through the net?
Well, the reality is right now that most of them are slipping through because we're not sharing information in real time, because we're not wrapping the right kind of support around them. So, when we've looked at the type of models that there are, then we think this will work with better information sharing and in smaller towns. And, you see it in the sort of Otahola model and how he works. So we've taken some of the best of that and extended it out and actually got education and MSD on board. So,
have any privacy or Bill of Rights concerns been raised about information sharing like that between MSD and the Ministry of Education?
yeah, well look, Cabinet's approved the Cabinet papers, and we're currently writing the legislation with all of that kind of in mind. I mean, the one thing I would say is that the whole system's kind of discriminatory. It sort of works with people based on their age and whether they've got children or not, and everything else. So, but there are issues that we're working through.
This talks about a new way of assessing people who are now on the sickness and invalid benefits. Does that signal a toughening up on those people, and how's that all going to work?
So that's coming up in the next stage of the reforms that you'll see later this year. But as we kind of indicated, those on the invalids benefit will be moving into, we're just giving it a different category, but the same criteria will be used. We announced that last year, so there's not sort of huge changes for those on the invalids. However, sickness could look quite different, so those on the sickness benefit will eventually merge with a job seeker and however just be temporarily exempt from work for a time while they're unable to work.
And what about people who are caring for the elderly or children with disability? Will there be more stringent tests on that?
Well, we announced that last year as well in our welfare reforms, and once we get into the sort of detail of that, we're working through, but we do see those that are on the DPB caring for the sick or infirm moving on to the supported living payment and being able to support them through that.
And you're also talking here about a childcare payment. Is that extra on what they already get? Is that going to be more support to help people?
Yes, it will, particularly for those teen parents. We're asking a lot of teen parents, and I think that it can be pretty scary if you've got a new baby and you are young and you're trying to sort of struggle. So we want to wrap real support around them with a private provider. So with someone in the community, whether it be EB-based or whether it be a community organisation. And we see ourselves wrapping it around them and them having substantially more support, both in help with early childcare education and their own education themselves. So yes.
So could that involve basically a payment of full-time, 40-hour-a-week childcare?
Yes, it could. Actually, it could actually be a little more than that by the time you put in travel and that sort of thing for them.
Okay, so basically it's a bit.
Sorry,
Sorry.
60,000 people on the sickness benefit. Does that mean that they are now all going to have to be reassessed as they go on to the job seeker?
That will be coming through in the next stage of our reform, so it's not part of the ones that we're announcing today. So they'll be coming through in more detail in that one.
That's good. So, I mean, the basic message I think is very clear, which is I don't think this current system we've got is sustainable. It's a system that was based on mutual obligation, and that has to be put back into the system. If you go and have a look at other OECD countries, New Zealand's had very low levels of work testing requirements. And when you've got a system which is costing the better part of $20 million a day, $8 billion a year, and is supporting 351,000 New Zealanders of working age, then I think you've got a system that's not working and functioning properly. And I think it's costing the taxpayers a lot of money, but it's also not delivering good outcomes for those who are on it. And we are determined to make change in a way which is beneficial to individuals, which supports them and invests in them, but ultimately sees these people in benefits.
Do you think employers are willing to take these people on?
Yeah, I do. Look, over time they will, as the labour markets tighten up and when they have training. A lot of people, these people actually want to genuinely get in work. I mean, I'm out and about every week, and I get lots of people come up to me and say that they're on sickness benefit or they're unemployed and they want a job. And I think this is all about trying to make sure that we make people work ready and able to carry out that employment.
So talk about jobs being out there. What sort of jobs? Is there one area that there's a lot of work available on?
Well, there's a big range, isn't there? I mean, look, at any one time we see a huge number of jobs advertised over the economy. And, you know, we do need to help people through that. We need to have an efficient economy which creates those jobs.
But are they good jobs for people, or are we talking about
Well, they're certainly going to be better than what someone's earning on a benefit. Because at the end of the day, their benefit payment is substantially lower than their paid employment. And if you go and look at the increased payments that people then get through working for families and their in-work tax credit, when you look at the overall contribution and income that they'll get into their household, what we do know is when we look at the analysis of youngsters in New Zealand that are living in conditions defined in the first world as being in poverty, they're almost exclusively coming from welfare-based homes.
Have you looked at two waves of reform that National did in the 90s in relation to sickness and invalid's benefits, where you did sort of the work testing, tightened up on going to the doctor, requirement to be ready for work, and it had no effect on the numbers, they kept on going up.
Well, I didn't specifically look to those, but I'm confident over time, as we saw with Future Focus, where there's a change in emphasis in the system, you'll get different outcomes, and I'm confident you're going to see that. But that's our job as a government to try and work through that system. But we've seen it with ACC as well. Again, when slight change in emphasis in the system allowed us to deliver, I think, a better system. And in the end, this is a system that all New Zealanders at some point might rely on. So the confidence New Zealanders need to have is that this system is going to be there for them on the day they might need it. And the current system is on a pathway, in my view, to not being economically sustainable.
Have you talked about the government maybe encouraging people into certain types of trainings? So we're going to have a shortage of construction workers over the next few
Well,
years.
we've done that in Christchurch. We put $43 million, I think, in the last budget into training people for the Christchurch rebuild. There's certainly plenty of other places we'll be focused on that.
Why is the current model not, economically sustainable, just in the sense that there are fewer people on benefits now than there were in 1991?
Yet it's 13% of the working age population. And I think if you go and have a look at what's wrong with countries in Europe, you can point to some pretty clear things. They have too much debt, they're not competitive, and they have too big a reliance on welfare. And New Zealand's got to make sure it's a competitive first world modern economy.
Are you worried about the rate of teen pregnancy, and if so, what moves are you making to curb it?
Well, a number of the moves. I mean, obviously the issues around when someone's work tested, they have another child on benefit. I think last year 4,300 children approximately were born to mothers that were already on benefit. So they're reasonably significant numbers. We do worry about that. The statistics don't point to good results there. And again, we want to deliver better outcomes for people.
Should Douglas Graham be stripped of his parliamentary perks? He gets this entitlement of a heavily subsidised overseas trip to Western flights every year. Titan Phillipfield lost his for a serious offence.
Yeah.
Should Douglas Graham lose his?
Well, again, I'm very reluctant to make any comments about his knighthood or those issues until the courts have had an opportunity to consider the matter. If I was to do so now, either one way or the other, I could be seen to be influencing their decision. I don't want to do that. There's also other legal remedies that might be available to Sir Douglas Graham and the other directors, that they might or might not want to
I'm
explore.
not asking about the night, I accept that
Yeah.
position idea, but what about when the parliamentary perks is something called Parliament? I know the Speaker has a directive around field.
Yeah.
What is do you think MPs, former MPs, who get convicted of something serious like this, should be entitled to further taxpayer perks the rest of their
Well,
life?
it's not a matter I have advice on today. I'll go away and consider that
You
in
have a
due
view on
course. Sorry?
Do you have a view on it?
Well, what I try and do is make sure that I'm consistent. And at this point, I just don't have advice. I need to go way back and have a look at those that have fallen foul of the law and those that have kept their benefits.
I
Maybe
think the
those
comments
that haven't.
around Tyler Phillip was that it wouldn't be appropriate if he kept his
Yeah.
perks at the time.
He exhausted all of his legal options and was sent to jail. So,
The
that's the state of that.
So you're saying we should wait till sentencing and an appeal process?
Well, that's the advice I've had. Yeah.
The Ports of Auckland dispute, is there a point at which the government might feel obliged to intervene or to mediate, or is it completely hands-off?
We'd be very reluctant to mediate, and the reason for that is that we don't step into industrial disputes when the government's not a party to that. I mean, we acknowledge that it's causing some concern in Auckland. We acknowledge that it's an industrial dispute that's turning ugly, but in the end it's for the parties to try and work that out.
There's some talk that Auckland shouldn't have a port in its prime real estate. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a long way away from where we are at the moment. At the moment it's a matter of resolving the issues they've got. I mean, there's been plenty of reports written on whether there's too many ports in New Zealand. We'll leave that for another day.
The unions have claimed with a number of disputes that in part it's been government legislative change which is encouraging employers to be aggressive. Do you?
Yeah, just that we don't accept that. I mean, if you go and have a look at the changes that the government made to industrial relations policy, it was largely around things like the 90-day probationary period. I don't think they'd be described as radical changes. There was some changes at the margin, nor do I think we've seen a flurry of industrial disputes. For the most part, employers, both in the private sector and public sector, have been able to manage their way through what are always a point of tension as you come to renegotiating a collective. But in the case of Ports of Auckland, that's a very protracted dispute because of some of the peculiarities about their industrial position.
Julia Gillard won the leadership battle today. Have you contacted her at all about that? Do you feel the need to?
I have. Look, I congratulated her. I had an exchange of text messages with her this afternoon. It was a very decisive win for her. I think she'll be relieved about that. Now she'll just get on with being Prime Minister of Australia.
Can you give us a little bit more information about those texts?
I congratulated her. I spoke to her over the weekend. At the end of the day, I know her well, and like any kind of leader that you have, that kind of professional relationship with, sometimes you need a bit of support.
Prime Minister,
Sorry?
It is the end of Kevin Rudd.
No, it's a matter for Kevin Rudd.
Prime Minister, have you made any decision on the government appealing the High Court to ruling on the OIO Quaker case?
Well, given that the FAE Consortium has appealed the second part of that decision, that has given the government reason to at least consider the matter, but we haven't taken it any further, and I haven't had any advice on that.
Will anyone make more focus on tobacco companies? Should he lose his job as well?
We certainly shouldn't lose his job. I mean, standard practice in the United States for corporates to sponsor events. My understanding was that there were quite a range of corporates that did that. He was there for a Trans-Pacific Partnership meeting, and that's a very important meeting that New Zealand's represented at, so I'm comfortable with his actions.
You said this morning you didn't know where Murray McCully was. Have you found him yet?
He was in Cabinet today. But I mean, the Foreign Minister travels extensively, and I don't look at his diary every 5 minutes.
But he hasn't been out of the country for the past couple of weeks, and he
But that's unusual, more often than not, he's away.
unusual for you not to know where he is when he's in the country.
Well, even then, I mean, I don't have a GPS device on the bloke. I mean, basically, when he's there, I assume he's there, and I sign his travel documents when they go overseas, but I sign them weeks in advance of when he actually travels.
Do you think then he should have been answering some questions around these NFAT job losses in Syria and other questions people have been trying to get on?
Well, I'm not here to defend him, but what I can say is that apparently there was some technical issue with his, his missing press secretary marks. There were some issues on one of the reasons.
Was he not getting emails?
Oh, well, he wasn't. Was getting text messages, I think, was that particular one. But look, at the end of the day, I mean, he's made it quite clear through a statement that the restructuring of the NFAT is something he's trying to give the chief executive some clear air over. I think that makes sense. They'll go through that process, and hopefully at the end of it come out with a stronger Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Just on,
rally today in Auckland calling for bail law reform. Will you consider their requests, and would you consider meeting with the Martel family?
I'm happy to meet with them. I actually had a very brief exchange with them on the Senate Television New Zealand this morning because they were on after me with breakfast. Made it clear to the family and to the Sensible Sensitivity Trust that we're not opposed to looking closely at their recommendations, and certainly we have great sympathy for their concerns. The government's in the process of introducing a new bail law which changes the burden of proof amongst other things, and I made it clear to them if they would make a submission to the Select Committee, then it would be my expectation that the Select Committee would consider their recommendations and ask Justice to look through the merits or otherwise.
And what was their response to that?
I think they were happy with that, yeah.
Just going back to the Crowfar Farms matter, you're considering the matter, you say, is this dependent on the Court of Appeal leaving, giving leave to the Fay Group to appeal that issue?
Well, I haven't had a good look at it, but my understanding is they've lodged an appeal. One assumes that they'll have a look at that. I mean, they're appealing the second part of the document test, as I understand it. All I can say is that the government is keen to make sure that the Overseas Investment Office fully understands the judgment from Justice Miller, because it's critically important that not only do they, being the Overseas Investment Office, understand the new interpretation of that law, but that the ministers that are asked to approve or decline that application fully understand the law. And until that position is clarified, I think it would be extremely dangerous for any party, either the ministers or the OIO, to move forward.
So that means the courts would have to clarify?
Well, I'm just saying I'm not ruling that out. It's possible that we seek some sort of declaratory judgment of what that actually means.
And you'd like
clarification, at least, of the law.
You'd like to have that done in the Court of Appeal hearing?
Well, I'm just saying I'm not ruling out. I've asked for some advice on what the best course going forward is. All I can say is unless people have confidence in what that ruling means, I'm not opposed to, I'm not making a case that the ruling is wrong or right. I'm just simply saying the critical factor now is understanding it. And until I'm in a position to, and everyone's in a position to understand that, I think that leaves the government in a terrible position, because ministers would ultimately could be judicially reviewed again, and no one wants to be in that position.
Because there are still two more avenues in the courts, aren't there?
Right.
So surely that would create uncertainty by leaving those options open, and that could take years.
Well, it may or may not. I mean, we may be able to get clarity on what the judgment means. I haven't seen a legal opinion based on what their current understanding is, but I've certainly asked for advice on what we think the ruling is.
When do you expect to get that?
Don't know.
So we're not going to get a decision out of the OIO in a matter of days, as they said immediately after that?
Well, I'm not controlling them, so at the end of the day, if the application's been put in and they've sought council's view on what the interpretation is, that is always possible, and you would need to ask the Overseas Investment Office. I clearly haven't and don't intend to, but I would be surprised if that happened. And certainly from the minister's point of view, I'd be very uncomfortable with them making a decision, because they have sole responsibility, those ministers, unless they fully understand the law.
Just on the Auckland transport issues, Prime Minister, you're pretty dark on the discussion document that Lee Brown came up with a week or two back. Do you expect
I
that
don't think they were my words, Ed.
You weren't very enthusiastic.
No, come on.
Now, Nick Smith's local government reforms, do you expect constraints that he's indicated will be placed on council's ability to raise debt and to also increase rates, will have an effect on the ability of local authorities to fund large infrastructure projects like the inner city railway?
Well, I think it's important to understand where we are in the process, which is the minister, as a new incoming minister, has voiced concerns about cumulative rate increases of approximately 7% a year. The minister has had some initial discussions with senior ministers about what a course of action could be followed, and what are some of the alternatives available. We as both, I guess, that group that will look at that and ultimately cabinet, haven't had an opportunity to discuss the merits of those, and we would expect to have some discussions also clearly with local government in New Zealand. So it's very, very early days, and so I can't go into great detail other than to say that it's important to understand when it comes to debt, that is a legitimate avenue for any council council in New Zealand, and obviously the size of Auckland's balance sheet and the ratepayer base dictates that they can carry a lot more debt than anyone else around the country. But equally, because they can only raise revenue, theoretically through essentially rates, we don't think it's sensible for them to get excessive amounts of debt on their balance sheet. In terms of other issues, well, it's a matter for another day.
Brett McKenzie's picked up an Oscar.
Is it?
For his trouble, should we get him working on a new national anthem?
Well, I don't know, there's enough debate over the national flag, but congratulations, great result by the Bungle, it's very good. Thanks very much.